All right, thank you, everybody. We'll look. We're gonna have plenty of time to chat through the morning, so don't feel like if you didn't get it all out right now, it's not a lost opportunity. All right. But what we're asking you to do this morning is really start thinking about story. And what you have is a handout that's if you're still missing some, feel free to grab. Um, there's there's elements of story that we all exist in, and we all exist in them subconsciously all the time. I think what I'm asking you to do is bring some of that subconscious to the conscious and start thinking about it. And I'm going to ask you to start. We're going to introduce elements of story, and I'm going to ask you to try to be intentional about looking at everything that you do through these lenses. Now, what we'll find is that more often than not, if we become uninterested in something, it's most likely because at some point in trying to understand the story of that thing, we lost one of these elements. And so we just stop listening. Because we talk a lot about here, like your brain is designed for efficiency. It's designed to get stuff done as fast as possible with as least energy output as possible. And so once we stop hearing elements of a story, our brains just are like, nope, not interested. Okay, so I want you to think about that and think about that as we journey through Acts. All right, so we all start, and you are the main character in your own story all the time. All right, and again, very few of us probably see ourselves as the villain. Most of us probably see ourselves as the hero in our own story. But it all starts with who you are. It's your pipiha. It's your, what's my name? Where am I from? You know, an important question to be able to answer is like, what's my name and where did I live when I was 10 years old? You know, like, some people be like, that's a long way. It's all right. You can remember. But then what we find is that whoever you are right now is a culmination of all of that is led before. All right, so for me, I'm right now standing on stage. I am a gathering of 40 years of stuff, 40 years of stories. Now, easier probably to comprehend is that my day today is about 4 years old. I am right now a culmination of 4 hours. Did I say 4 years? That's not how days work, folks. I'm glad you guys are very polite in that you were just like, well, let's just let him have it. I'm right now a culmination of the last 4 hours of my life. When the moment you wake up, and I think we understand that, like what you come here as, you know, if you had a bad morning, you come here carrying that. If you have a great morning, you come here carrying that. If you come here with if you had a bad weekend, you come here carrying that. Anywhere you are at any moment, you are a culmination of the stories that happened before. Okay. Now, Acts 24, we're going to use this as an example. So there's characters in Acts 24. There's Tertullus, who's a lawyer. He's from high priests. He's a lawyer from Jerusalem. We have another character, which is Felix, who's the governor in Caesarea. So Caesarea is the capital of that area. Jerusalem is part of that area. All right, so Caesarea is where the Roman capital of that space is. And then we have Paul, who at this point was the arrested leader, one of the arrested leaders of the Jewish followers, the Jesus followers, sorry. All right, so those are the three main characters in the story. So we're going to read from chapter 24. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus. And they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented him his case before Felix. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reform in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. Now, what do we know about these characters? What are their names? What are their stories? because that's the start of every story we ever tell. Who was this person before this moment? All right, Tertullus. He was from Jerusalem, which was under Roman occupation. Jerusalem was the religious capital of Jewish society, Judaism. That was a way of functioning in society that was completely controlled by the church. Everything that was decided, all political decisions, everything in that culture at that time was church-driven. The high priest was basically the president. All right, so Tertullus was part of that society and was representing the high priest in front of this governor. And what he was representing was religious adherence, because that was the main rule of that society. Okay? Felix was a governor, but he started as a slave. And that tells us a lot. So Felix, a slave in Rome who climbed his way up to be a governor, which is really, really impressive. Okay, but something that we understand about that, if we understand Roman culture and how the Roman Empire worked, is if you were of a prominent family, you could climb your way up a political ladder by just calling in favors, saying, hey, my son needs a job, give him a job, he climbs up, we'll give him governorship. If you were a slave, you didn't have that luxury. You had to earn it. And the way you earned it in the Holy Roman Empire was through brutality. So, in order for him to climb from slavery to governor, he had to be bold and brash and very quick to roll heads. If there was trouble, he had to squash it. If there was rebellion, he had to squash it. Which is interesting because when we go back to Tertullus' introduction and his greeting of Felix, remember he says, we have enjoyed a long period of peace under you. No, they hadn't. What they enjoyed was domination. But to Felix, well, that's how you bring peace. Right? So we have this language being used, and one guy is trying to tell one story, and the other guy has a story that this guy is trying to speak into. Tertullus knows what he's doing when he says, we've experienced peace under you. And Felix knows what he's saying. No, you haven't, but you're under control, and that's the same. He was known for being swift and bold and brutal, and when you're born into nobility, you can afford to not be, but when you come into the Roman Empire as a slave, you have to be extra. Now, this province, this part of the Roman Empire, was particularly tough because of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was very hard to control. There were constantly riots. There were constantly talks of rebellion. There was constantly some messianic figure stepping up and saying, I'm going to lead my people out of your occupation. So someone like Felix had to constantly be on his toes, ready to take swift action. That's what we understand about Felix to this point. Then there's Paul. Jewish-born Roman citizen, trained as a Pharisee, best of the best within the Jewish religious structures, within that elite society, violent persecution of the way, the people of Jesus, until he was confronted by Jesus on the road to Damascus, learned then from the followers of Jesus, took up a calling to Gentile expansion of the long exclusive church. So these are the relevant story beats, and it's what we're always looking for. Anytime we hear a story, what's the relevant stuff to me? Because if you notice, have you ever heard a story that just isn't a story? Right? I think we're always looking for certain elements, and if I just start by hey, I'm going to tell you a story, and I start my first memory was walking out of a house, and we were moving, and I saw a bunch of pebbles on the ground, and those pebbles, I remember seeing them in our goldfish bowl, and then I asked my mom, what happened to the goldfish? And she just said, oh, he's staying here, son. And then I got in the car, and then we moved to a new house. Now, years later, I have to sit and think about that. That's the first memory I have. Pretty sure my mom murdered my goldfish, is what that means. All right? And then what I would do is I would just keep telling every memory I have. And eventually you would all go, what are we doing here? Are we just listening to Nathan's entire life story? Because what you're looking for is, what is he trying to say and what's relevant to that? So those are the relevant story beats to where we are in the book of Acts. Whenever you're telling a story, always understand that you don't tell all the stories. Pick one. All right, so that's what we're doing here in Acts. We picked one. Not the entire story, just the stuff that adds to the story you're telling, relevant to, and this is the important next step in any story, it's got to be relevant to the question you're asking. Because every good story is asking a question. Questions. So we have questions. The goal should always be, what's the deeper question? Right? That's Jewish society did that very well. That's something Jesus introduced us. That's something the parables did very well. What's the deeper question? You'll notice that when Jesus was teaching, someone would ask him a question, and he always had a question in return because he was always looking for, there's a deeper question. There's something deeper. Those can very simply be broken up into three categories, but the first thing is you'll notice that no good story has a question that's easily answered. So every morning when I wake up, my alarm goes off, and I reach down beside my bed and I grab my clothes, and I grab my sweatpants and my socks because I like warm feet in the morning, and I grab a shirt, and then I put those on. And this morning I reached down and I grabbed my socks and I grabbed my shirt, and I couldn't find my pants. So then I reached down a second time and I found those pants. And all of you are thinking, that's the story? So that's an example of, we're just not interested in stories that have very easily answerable questions. All right, that's an uninteresting story. But you guys were really let down because I really had you, didn't I? Yeah? You were like, where's this going? No, just put pants on, that's all. That's how my morning went. So we don't tell those stories. The Bible isn't full of those stories. We're not interested in those stories. What we're interested in is, what's the question being asked? Usually we start with an external question. Those are surface level. All right, I'm hungry. All right, where do I get food? It's a surface level concept, right? That's pretty easy to solve. But the question is, am I asking something deeper? Am I presenting something deeper? You're hungry. Okay, well, go get some food. Well, I can't. Why not? Yeah, because then we get to, okay, that's a better question. Why not? Why can't you get food? And then what we do is so that's the deeper, and that's usually personal. So the first question is, here's this thing. The second question is, why do I care? All right, why are we bothered with this? And then what we can usually do is get to a deeper philosophical question. I'm hungry. Okay, go get some food. I can't. Why not? Well, because I don't have any money. I can't afford groceries. Well, why not? And is it just this initial didn't get paid this week, or do we have a philosophical systemic issue that groceries are just a ridiculous price? So we start to dig, and as we ask those questions, eventually you start to get to, hey, there's an issue here. So it goes from what's my presenting need to why should you care to why should we all care? All right, these questions are what drive almost everything that we do. Why do you come here on a Sunday morning? Why are you the way that you are? Why do you act the way that you act? And the big question that we're really trying to ask in any of these stories is, what's missing and who am I trying to become? At the start of this, who was I and who would I like to be at the end of it? And then what's stopping me from getting there? So the next thing we look for is direction. Because, again, like, I can solve the whole just reach down again and grab your pants. I can solve that issue. I don't need help with that. All right? But there are some questions that we do need help with, and those are what make good story. All right? Those are the stories we tell. I couldn't get this, and here's what helped me get it. All right. So the next thing we're looking for is when we can't answer something ourselves, we need help. Where do we look? Now, we're usually looking for experience that manifests itself as empathy and expertise. All right, so one of the things, so we have the Bridge that works on site here. So Bridge is involved in addiction recovery. So they work with people all year round on helping them recover from addiction. Now, what they have found is that people who themselves have gone through addiction have a lot easier time connecting to people trying to break free from addiction. Why? Because immediately those people say, I know this person knows what I've gone through. And that person can say, I've been there, I've been where you are, and I know how to get to the other side of that. There's an empathy. I actually know how you're feeling. I don't just think I know how you're feeling. I'm not making guesses at how you're feeling. I was there. We all know that when we have a problem, if you can find someone who also went through that problem, there's an immediate, deeper connection to that help. We understand that. And so that person has empathy, and especially if they've made it to the other side, they've learned some things. So when we're looking for direction, when we're looking for, I'd like to get from this to that, if you can find someone who has already been on that journey, you get that. This person has done it. I want to learn as well. So there's an empathy. These come in things like, coaches. That's why we look to coaches. Sport coaches are paid because they carry an expertise in a field of work. There's a trust. There's testimonials that come with that. I joined this team. This person helped me become this kind of thing. They helped me achieve these things. Personal trainers. I joined this. I paid this person. That person helped me get from that to that. I paid for their expertise. Mentors, like the people we look to, because here's the reality is whether we understand it or not, every single one of us, when we're going through that story and we hit that question that we can't answer ourselves, we are then looking for someone who can guide us through that. Every movie you've ever loved has that person in it. Why? Because we disconnect from movies that don't. We don't actually enjoy movies where the person who has the problem can just solve it all themselves. It's not, and the reason we don't enjoy it is because we can't relate to it. And then we have mentors, we have coaches, and then we have communities. Now, if I was to make a wild guess at why people come here on a Sunday morning, my guess would be that there's a community of like-minded people who we can gather with. Because there's nothing else that you get when you come here that you can't just get at home. There's no level of teaching that I can bring to you that I'm not stealing from someone else anyway, right? If you do enough reading and watch enough videos and learn from enough people, you'll hear everything I have ever said. You can listen to music at home. You can do all these things by yourself. So there must be some other reason why we come here. If I had to take a guess, I would guess that it is because there's community here. There's like-minded people. There is empathy and experience that we can learn from. And some days, when the question is, does anybody care about me? The hope is that you could come to a place like this and go, oh, yep. Because at the end of the day, every time you make every decision, every time you enter this building, you're asking a question. So then we get back to Acts, verse 5. Tertullus, we have found this man, he's speaking to Felix about Paul, to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots amongst the Jews and all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple, so we seized him. So my translation has, I don't know if yours has a skipped verse 7, but mine just has a 7 and a blank. So I think we just pause there, and then we get to 8. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him. Verse 9, the other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. In other words, Paul is causing trouble, and we know, Felix, your story well enough to know that you've made your name by coming down harshly on trouble. Riots, I said riots, and Felix, as a governor, you do not like that word, because one of the main things the Roman Empire and the Roman army will respond to is a riot, because a riot tells a story of rebellion, it tells a story of a lack of control, and a society governed by control can't just have riots. Therefore, if I say that Paul is starting a riot, the Roman governor will listen. He's also saying that Paul is leading a sect, and he has broken our laws, and he has desecrated our temple, and that's why we arrested him. And he's all yours, but we think you know what you're supposed to do. That's essentially what that speech was. He is speaking directly to Felix's story. Felix has a narrative. He's putting Felix in the place of, you're the hero in this story. Would you like to remain the hero? Here's a way to do that. The governor of that area also knows that they have to appease Jerusalem. That is the biggest threat to their sense of control over that space. If they can appease Jerusalem, they can keep peace a little longer. Tertullus is saying, without saying, we would enjoy it if you did this. So why don't you do us a favor? For Felix, his questions. His external question was, I'm a slave. I don't really like that. All right, his internal question was, slavery is not really my career choice. Do I want to stay in this long term? All right, his philosophical question is, how do I get out of this? What are my options? The directions he has available to him are run away, which didn't usually end well, or die, which also isn't the ideal ending, or, because this had been painted as the Roman dream, you can go from lowly slave to governor. And this was something the Romans did very well. They painted this picture of hope. Like, you can go from somebody we've conquered and enslaved to somebody who conquers and enslaves. So he was inspired by the Roman dream. He would have had mentors. He would have had guides. He would have had people who were like, I can help you do this. I did this. So he chose that one. He chose to climb. And he would have seen others, and that's that Roman story. And Tertullus knows what he's doing. He knows that he's tugging at Felix's own story. He stated things in a way that presents Felix with this direction that Felix has already chosen. And here's the problem, and I think you know the solution. And he's also ensuring, in a quite clever way, that Felix remain the hero and the main character in this story. This is a manipulation 101. Tell somebody a story they want to hear and convince them that it's their idea. Now, Felix then invites Paul to respond. So in verse 10, we pick up that. When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. You notice the shift in tone. So Tertullus did this whole like, oh, we've been at peace under you, and you've been just, and Paul says, I know this is your job, so I'm happy to speak to this. Paul does an adequate job of keeping Felix as the hero in his own story. He says, you can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city, and they cannot prove to you any charges they're making against me. Paul keeps it very tight and very simple, which he understands Felix has had to do his entire career. Paul then shifts the narrative. Because who's Paul? What are his life questions? What's his decided direction? And there's always a guide that helps us to set that direction to those unanswered questions. And for Paul, originally that was the synagogue, that was the temple, those were the priests, that was that whole system and structure, and that's what he was raised in, and he was very good at that. But then he has his meeting on the road, and he shifts his guide. His guide was this system that determines these things. He then has an encounter with Jesus, and his guide becomes Cornelius and disciples and Peter and Timothy and a completely different direction to the direction he was on. But what was his main question? We get a glimpse of it in verse 14. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. And I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clean before God and man. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you to bring charges if they have anything against me. So he did kind of stir up a bit of a ruckus in Ephesus, if we remember the 2-hour chanting session. Paul did do that. But what he's saying here is, I know the law well enough to know that those charges can't be brought by someone who wasn't there. So if you want to call Ephesus, go ahead. This is kind of Paul going, there was that one, though. Or these who here should state what crime they found me in when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Unless it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. And this is a really interesting part, and I've read Acts so many times, and I've never really comprehended this thing. This is Paul showing his heart. And I think it's easy when we think of ourselves now as the hero in this narrative. Because we think, oh, Paul did this for us. That's the easy thing for us to think about. But Paul's heart was always that everyone would accept this. Paul's heart was never that the Jews would reject this. Because Paul's heart at the very beginning was that his people would be close to God. And all the persecution that he took part in the first half of his life were, if we adhere to these things, we can keep close to God. If we let other things in, we lose that connection, we lose that, and God will abandon us. That was his belief. And so his belief was, we have to protect this at all costs. And then he has this moment with Jesus, and Jesus explains to him that it is not this that he should be protecting, it is the people. And Paul's heart the whole time is that all people would be closer to God. And you hear his heart come out here, and he stands before, and he's being accused by his own people. And he stands there and says, I always thought that this could work. And I thought Jesus was the fulfillment of the law, and you guys know me well enough to know that I have strong thoughts and opinions. Because you guys egged me on to round up these Christians and to put them in jail and to kill them. You know I was there when we stoned Stephen. You know that I'm not trying to cause trouble. You know that I'm not trying to cause riots. You know that my heart is that all of us would be close to God. And he says, and then I came to my people, and I brought gifts for the poor, and I just came to church to express my worship. And this is Paul pouring out his heart. My heart was just that all of us would be closer to God. And the closer I got to God, the more I realized that Jesus' heart was for all people, not just those we've decided it's for, not just us, not just the elite. And so the next part of any story are that whoever or whatever that guides us from becoming those things, it always has a plan and a call to action, and we see that in Jesus. The teachers of the law had a plan, and that was protect the law at all costs. Their call to action was, Paul, go do something about these Jesus followers. And Jesus had a plan. He presented it to Paul, and his plan was protect the people, look after the people, love the people, spread this to the people, share this with the people. And his call to action was for Paul to live out a better story, to love God and to love others and to eat from the better tree. So back to Felix, verse 22. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias, the commander, comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. So again, prison then, he was in prison before trial, all right? Prison wasn't usually an after-trial sentence. They kept him there because they knew the Jews wanted to kill him. Everywhere he went, trouble rose up. They were trying to keep control. They were trying to keep him from getting murdered. Now, the whole freedom and stuff, so when you're imprisoned by Rome, they don't feed you. There's not a prison program. So him allowing his friends and stuff to come bring him food, that's just, will keep Paul alive. We're not going to make him starve to death. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Jesus Christ. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, that's enough for now. You can go. When I find it convenient, I'll send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently. And I'm pretty sure every once in a while he was like, so maybe I'll let you go if you need money. That was pretty normal. Felix wasn't being weird. That was normal. Right? That was what they all did. Now again, Felix was a slave that climbed to being governor. He had to do stuff. He had to find ways to get ahead. So that's what he was doing. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. 2 years. There still hasn't been a trial, by the way, for Paul. We're going to get into the rest of it next week. Next week, we're going to do 25 and 26. What I'm going to encourage you to do is read through 25 and 26. Look for story elements. Who are the characters? What are their stories? What we're going to do the rest of the morning is we're going to spend time in story. What I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to think through elements of story, and I'm going to ask you to think about yourself. I'm going to ask you to think of yourself as the hero in your own story. And I'm just going to ask you to pick a question. If you got something deep going on for you right now, explore it. If you need a default question, I think a really interesting question to ask is, why do I come here on a Sunday morning? What is it I'm looking for? And always ask yourself the deeper question. If the question is, I like music, so I come here for music, ask yourself the deeper question. Why don't you go somewhere else for music? Why don't you listen to music somewhere else? What is it about music here? Now, I was chatting with a guy yesterday. We were talking about concerts and live music. And he made the comment that there is just something otherworldly about a room full of people singing together. And that, for me, that was a really interesting thing to think through, because you can watch music on TV, but being in a concert feels different. Yeah, there's a difference. What is that? Because our initial is, I think I like music. Yeah, but what about it? What is it speaks to? Okay, so if you have other questions that you're trying to explore them. So I resonate a lot with Shar. The Shar's question of, should I move to another country, and what does that mean for me? So I went through the same thing when I was 20, when I was deciding to move to New Zealand. And I remember before I did that, I went and visited as many friends as I could and just said, I'm about to move. Can you think of any reason why I shouldn't? What I was trying to figure out, because the question I was asking is, am I about to change my life forever? Because I think deep down I understood, if I move to another country for any length of time, that changes you. Am I ready for that change, or would I rather stay what I was? You might have one of those things you're thinking through. In 2 years' time, do I want to tell the story of, I've just picked what I've always known? Or in 2 years' time, do I want to tell a story of, and then that morning, decided something different? We're going to explore that, and I'm going to encourage you to explore that with each other. Ask each other questions, and I'm actually encouraging you to be a little bit selfish here in this, and think about yourself. Think about what your questions are. What are you exploring right now? And then start asking yourself questions like, who can actually guide me through this? If I'm Luke Skywalker, who is my Yoda? Right? That's if I'm trying to go this direction, who's been there before? And I think work through the elements of story, talk with each other. I'm encouraging you we're going to spend the rest of the morning just share with each other. Share your story. All right? Again, don't tell your whole story. Pick something. Pick a moment in your life. And then I think one of the final important things is your story doesn't have to end in success for you to be different because of it. All right? And often we have these stories that we explore, and they might end in failure, and that might change us more than the success would have. And in fact, often we are more changed by loss than we are by victory. So, what were you before? What questions did you start asking? What guidance did you take? What was the plan? What was the call to action? What did you do? And did it work? And what did you become on the end of it either way? So, I'm just going to pray. We're going to close our time here. And I'm going to encourage you to grab a cup of tea or coffee or whatever you drink and just grab somebody and explore story together. Next week, we're going to dig right back into story. We're going to carry on with chapters 25 and 26. We're going to dig into what this means and what is the story being told and what's 2,000 years later our part in it. All right, let's pray. God, we just ask you to reveal to us the story that's going on. Whatever is happening for any of us here, God, we pray that you speak into it. God, our prayer this morning is that you help us to explore the story and to ask good questions and to ask deeper questions. And as we share together, God, we pray that you just keep speaking into us a community of love and community of journeying together. God, we pray that you bring us into a space of curiosity and adventure. So help us to keep exploring today. And as we carry on in this time of worship together, we ask that you just keep speaking into your people. We thank you for all that you provide us with. Thank you for all that you're going to do for us this week. And we ask that this week just be an exploring story. Amen. All right, hang out, share story.